The most feared alpha in Soul's underworld was on his knees, his Tom Ford suit ruined by mud and rain, weeping like a broken man who had lost his reason to breathe. It was a paradox that would shatter the legends whispered about Derek Choi in smoky backrooms and blood-stained boardrooms. They called him Biko, the White Tiger, a predator whose dominance made even rival alphas bow their heads in submission. He had built an empire on calculated violence and ice-cold strategy, a man who crushed rebellions with a single phone call and negotiated treaties over the corpses of those foolish enough to challenge him. Yet here, in the suffocating darkness of the private cemetery, his pheromones bleeding raw anguish into the rain-soaked air, he was merely a mate whose soul had been carved out and buried 6 feet under. The mourners had scattered hours ago, their black umbrellas and hollow sympathies disappearing into the soul night, leaving him alone with the unbearable truth of the marble headstone. The stone gleamed even in the darkness, cold and eternal, bearing the name that had been his salvation, Ario Choi. Below it, the dates of a life extinguished far too soon, a life that had been fierce and brilliant just 7 days ago. White camellias surrounded the grave, their pale petals ghostly against the dark earth, their delicate beauty a cruel mockery of the violence that had stolen his omega. Derek's hands that had killed, conquered, commanded, trembled as they pressed against the wet marble, his bond mark burning with phantom fire that should be impossible if his mate was truly gone. He had failed the most sacred duty of an alpha, protecting his bonded husband from the monsters in his own house. The grief wasn't just emotional weight, it was physical torture, a suffocating pressure that made his inner wolf howl in agony, that made every breath feel like drowning. He remembered the frantic call, the race to the penthouse, Dr. Yun's grave voice pronouncing acute heat shock syndrome, a medical tragedy no amount of power could reverse. But as Derek knelt in the mud, a predator's instinct whispered that something was wrong. Ario had been healthy, strong, sharp as a blade hidden in silk. He pressed his forehead to the cold stone and released a guttural roar, primal, agonized, utterly broken. Let the city hear. Let his empire crumble. Without Ario, he was nothing but a monster who had finally lost his humanity. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't see through his grief-blind rage, was the figure standing 30 feet away, concealed behind a stone angel monument. Draped in black, face hidden by mourning veils, Ario watched his alpha shatter, one hand pressed against his own bond mark that burned with the same impossible fire. His lips moved soundlessly, "I'm sorry, my love. But I need you angry, not broken." 3 days earlier, Soul's underworld had known Derek Choi as a force of nature. Immovable, unbreakable, utterly merciless. They whispered his name in the basements of Gangnam clubs and the private rooms of Itaewon restaurants where deals were sealed in blood and soju. Biko. The White Tiger. An alpha so dominant that even the heads of rival families instinctively dropped their gazes when he entered a room, their own alpha pheromones cowering before his overwhelming presence. He controlled 60% of Busan Port, the largest smuggling operation in East Asia, and his network stretched from the docks to the National Assembly. Politicians trembled when his name appeared on their phones. Yakuza bosses in Osaka paid tribute. Triad leaders in Hong Kong negotiated through intermediaries because facing Derek directly was considered a death wish for one's pride, or one's life. At 34, he had done what his father spent a lifetime building, and he'd done it in half the time with twice the efficiency and none of the mercy. The Choi Syndicate didn't just survive under his rule, it thrived, evolved, became something more dangerous than a criminal organization. It became inevitable. But empires mean nothing when the emperor has forgotten why he built them. Derek stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, 60 stories above Seoul, and felt nothing. The city sprawled beneath him in a sea of lights, his city, his kingdom, his cage. He hadn't left this apartment in 3 days. Hadn't showered. Hadn't eaten anything that wasn't brought by his terrified assistant and left outside the door like an offering to a feral animal. The syndicate was fracturing without his iron grip. He knew this intellectually. Knew that captains were making moves, that shipments were being delayed, that the delicate balance of power he'd maintained through sheer force of will was beginning to tilt. He simply couldn't bring himself to care. His reflection in the glass was a stranger, hollow-eyed, unshaven, still wearing the shirt from Ario's funeral that reeked of cemetery oath and his own corrosive grief. The bond mark on his neck, that sacred brand of silver and black that marked him as mated, as owned, as loved, burned constantly now. A phantom pain that made no biological sense if his Omega was truly dead. The flashback hit him without warning, as it had every hour since that night. 7 days ago. Their penthouse. The private dining room where they always had dinner together, no matter how late Derek came home, no matter how blood-stained his day had been. Ario had made japchae, Derek's favorite, the glass noodles glistening with sesame oil and vegetables. But Derek had been distracted, reviewing reports on his phone, barely tasting the food, grunting responses to Ario's attempts at conversation. Derek. Ario's voice had been patient, but edged with something Derek was too busy to identify. Look at me. He glanced up, annoyed at the interruption, and saw his Omega watching him with those dark, knowing eyes that could read him better than any strategist read a battlefield. I'm here, Derek had said, the lie tasting bitter even then. No, you're not. Ario had smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You haven't scented me properly in 3 weeks. You barely touch me anymore unless it's... I'm building something for us, Derek had snapped, his alpha pride flaring. Everything I do is to keep you safe. I don't need safe, Derek. I need you. But Derek had returned to his phone, dismissing the conversation, dismissing the hurt in his mate's voice. An hour later, Dr. Yun had arrived for a routine checkup. The syndicate's physician, a beta who'd served the Choi family for 15 years, always reliable, always professional. He'd brought traditional tea, something to balance Omega hormones during the preheat phase. Derek had been in his office when he heard the crash. He'd found Ario on the dining room floor, convulsing, lips turning blue, foam at the corners of his mouth, fingers clawing at his own throat. The teacup shattered beside him, the liquid soaking into the carpet. Derek had screamed for Dr. Yun, had cradled Ario's seizing body, had felt utterly, horrifyingly helpless as his mate's eyes rolled back. Acute heat shock syndrome, Dr. Yun had pronounced 2 hours later at the hospital, his voice grave, clinical. It's rare, but it happens. The Omega biology is delicate, especially under stress. His system just shut down. There was nothing anyone could have done. Ario had died in Derek's arms before they reached the emergency room. No last words. No goodbye. Just the terrible, final silence of a bond breaking. Derek pressed his forehead against the cold window, his breath fogging the glass. The guilt was a living thing inside him, eating him from the inside out. He'd been distant. Cold. Too obsessed with expansion, with consolidating power, with building an empire he'd promised would protect Ario, while neglecting the very person he'd built it for. His phone buzzed for the 100th time. His beta assistant, Jihoon, again. The syndicate needed him. The families were asking questions. Minho was stepping up to help manage things. Minho. His half-brother, always so helpful, always hovering at the edges of power with that concerned smile and ambitious eyes. Derek forced himself to move. To shower. To dress in a black suit that felt like armor he no longer deserved to wear. The syndicate needed Biko, even if the man underneath was a hollow shell. The Choi headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in Gangnam. When Derek stepped off his private elevator, the entire floor went silent. Staff froze. Enforcers bowed. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Minho was waiting in Derek's office, sitting in one of the visitor chairs with studied casualness. He stood when Derek entered, his expression carefully arranged into brotherly concern. Hyung. I'm glad you're here. We were worried. I'm fine. Derek's voice was gravel and broken glass. Of course. Of course. Minho moved closer, his beta scent trying to be soothing but landing somewhere near predatory. I've been handling the urgent matters. The port situation, the distribution routes. You don't need to worry about anything. Just focus on healing. There was something in the way he said healing that made Derek's inner wolf snarl. Like Minho was already measuring the crown. Thank you, Derek said flatly. Now leave. After Minho departed, Derek collapsed into his chair and pulled up the security system. Not syndicate business. Not the reports waiting for his attention. He navigated to the home surveillance footage, scrolling back 2 weeks to when Ario was still alive. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The bedroom camera showed Ario sleeping, curled on his side, Dark hair spread across the pillow. Derek had been in Shanghai that night. Had missed another dinner. Another chance to be present. He watched his dead husband breathe. Watched him shift in sleep, reaching unconsciously for Derek's empty side of the bed. The door opened. Jihoon stepped in, then froze. "Sir, the quarterly reports are." "Get out." Jihoon fled. Derek kept watching the footage, his fingers trembling on the mouse, rewinding to watch Ario breathe again. And again. And again. Searching for the moment he'd lost everything without even knowing it was slipping away. Ario's first conscious thought after death was that morgue drawers were colder than he'd imagined. The second was that his bond mark was still burning, which meant either the afterlife had a cruel sense of irony, or he wasn't actually dead. The metal drawer slid open with a mechanical hiss, and Ario found himself staring up at an elderly Omega woman whose face was creased with years but whose eyes were sharp as surgical steel. She pressed a weathered hand to his chest, feeling for his heartbeat, and her scent, gentle jasmine with an undertone of hospital antiseptic, washed over him in a wave of unexpected safety. Child, she whispered in Korean, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades around death and knew how to recognize when it was real. Don't try to speak yet. The toxin is still in your system. Toxin. Not heat shock. Not a medical tragedy. Murder. The memory crashed into him like a tidal wave. The dinner. Derek across from him, beautiful and distant, his attention fractured between his Omega husband and the empire that was slowly consuming him. Ario had made japchae, had tried to bridge the growing chasm between them with food and conversation and patience he was running out of. Dr. Yun had arrived with his black medical bag and his beta efficiency, all professional concern. Just a routine hormone check, Ario sigh. And I brought you some traditional tea, Omega Cha. It'll help with the preheat discomfort. Ario had accepted the cup because Dr. Yun had been with the Choi family for 15 years, because Derek trusted him implicitly, because Ario's own investigation into syndicate corruption hadn't yet connected the dots to the man standing in his dining room with poison in a teacup. The first sip had been bitter. Wrong. By the second sip, Ario's Omega instincts were screaming danger, but the toxin was already racing through his bloodstream, turning his nervous system into a weapon against itself. He'd managed to stand, to reach for Derek, before his legs gave out. The last thing he remembered was Derek's face, terrified, helpless, completely unprepared for the violence invading their sanctuary. And the terrible knowledge that his alpha would blame himself for this. Omega-specific neurotoxin, Mrs. Kang explained quietly, helping Ario sit up in the drawer. They were alone in the morgue, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the chemical smell of formaldehyde thick in the cold air. Derived from a rare Korean plant compound. It mimics the symptoms of acute heat shock syndrome, seizures, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest. Nearly untraceable in standard autopsies, especially if the examiner isn't looking for it. How did you? I've been a coroner for 40 years, child. I know the scent of murder when it's dressed up as natural causes. Her expression hardened. And I know what it smells like when powerful men try to eliminate the omegas they see as inconvenient. Ario's hands trembled as he touched his own throat, feeling the ghost of suffocation. Derek is not responsible. Mrs. Kang's voice was firm. I heard them. The beta doctor and the half-brother. They came to verify the body before the official autopsy. The morgue door had been partially open. Ario, barely conscious and hidden in the drawer Mrs. Kang had deliberately left unsealed, had heard every word. Minho's voice, smooth and satisfied, the Omega was making Derek soft. Distracted. He spent more time worrying about his pretty husband than running the empire our father built. Dr. Yun, clinical and cold, the toxin is untraceable. They'll rule it natural causes. Derek will grieve, spiral, make mistakes. We'll have full control within 40 days. You're sure the bond won't? The bond should kill him slowly. Broken mate bonds are agony for alphas. He'll be weak, vulnerable, easy to remove when the time comes. They'd laughed. Actually laughed while discussing the murder of Derek's mate and the planned execution of Derek himself. The rage that had filled Ario in that moment was incandescent, purifying. Not the hot anger of impulse, but the cold, calculated fury of an Omega who'd been underestimated his entire life and had finally been given a reason to show his teeth. Because the devastating truth was clear, Derek hadn't known. Derek wasn't the enemy. Derek was a target too. And Ario had been investigating Dr. Yun for months, following a trail of missing Omegas, suspicious medical complications, and syndicate funds that disappeared into offshore accounts labeled as health initiatives. He'd been building a case in secret, too proud to bring his suspicions to Derek until he had irrefutable proof, too determined to prove he wasn't just the Alpha's protected husband but a strategic force in his own right. They'd killed him to silence his investigation. And they'd killed him to weaken Derek. 2 birds, 1 poisoned teacup. Mrs. Kang had smuggled him out of the hospital morgue in a body bag labeled as medical waste, had brought him to her traditional hanok in Bukit, a neighborhood of old Korean houses tucked into the hills above Seoul, where elderly Omegas lived quietly and asked no questions. Here, surrounded by paper screens and heating floors and the scent of dried herbs, Ario had recovered. Had planned. Had decided. He would stay dead. Become a ghost. And he would haunt the bastards until they tore each other apart with paranoia. But first, he had to survive watching Derek grieve. The news played constantly on Mrs. Kang's small television. Ario sat in traditional hanbok, his body still weak, his bond mark a constant ache, and watched footage of his own funeral. The procession through Seoul. The private cemetery. The marble headstone that cost more than most people earned in a year. And then, Derek. On his knees in the rain, suit ruined, hands pressed to the grave like he could dig through marble and earth to reach the Omega he thought he'd lost. The camera was distant, shaky, probably shot by some brave or stupid journalist. But it captured everything. The way Derek's shoulders shook. The way he bent forward until his forehead touched the stone. The way he screamed, a sound so raw and broken that Ario's bond mark flared in sympathetic agony. "Turn it off," Ario whispered, tears streaming down his face, his hand clutching his chest where the bond burned. "Please." But he couldn't look away. Couldn't stop watching his alpha shatter. "Hold on, my love," Ario thought, pressing his palm flat against the television screen where Derek's image flickered. "I'm coming. But I need you angry, not broken. I need you dangerous. Because we're going to burn them all." The private room at Club Eclipse was designed for secrecy and sin. Located in the sub-basement of one of Gangnam's most exclusive alpha establishments, it was where deals too dirty for even the syndicate's boardrooms were negotiated over aged whiskey and the kind of silence money could buy. The walls were soundproofed. The staff were paid to forget faces. The security cameras had been malfunctioning for years. Perfect for treason. Minho Choi swirled 25-year-old scotch in a crystal glass, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. Across from him, Dr. Yun sat with the rigid posture of a man who'd spent his life compensating for being born beta in a world that worshipped alpha dominance. They'd been here for an hour, waiting for the weight of what they'd done to settle into reality. They'd killed the White Tiger's mate. And the White Tiger hadn't torn them apart. Which meant the plan was working. "To the future," Minho said, raising his glass with a smile that would have looked brotherly to anyone who didn't know better. "To new leadership. To the empire father should have left to someone who actually deserves it." Dr. Yun clinked his glass against Minho's, his beta scent carefully neutral, professionally bland, the olfactory equivalent of hospital corridors and medical forms. "To removing obstacles. And to the elimination of weaknesses that have plagued this organization for too long." They drank. The scotch burned smooth and expensive. "How long do you think before he breaks completely?" Minho asked, leaning back into the leather booth. He was handsome in the way second sons often were, polished, charming, with an edge of hunger that never quite faded. Derek had the alpha presence, the raw dominance that made men kneel. Minho had ambition, and he'd learned early that ambition was sharper than any genetic advantage. 40 days, Dr. Yun said with clinical certainty. The traditional mourning period. "We follow protocol, express concern, slowly suggest that perhaps Derek needs to step back for his mental health. The families will support it, they've seen him deteriorating. By the time mourning ends, he'll be so far gone that a temporary leave of absence will seem like mercy." And then? An accident. Dr. Yun's voice didn't waver. Traffic. A rival family's retaliation. Something clean that doesn't point back to us. You assume leadership as the grieving brother who tried to hold things together. I remain as chief medical advisor and your right hand. We restructure the syndicate properly. No more Omega influence, Minho said, and there was venom in his voice now. No more consultations with mates who have no business in syndicate strategy. No more treating them like they're anything but what nature intended, vessels for A's and status symbols. Dr. Yun's expression tightened with satisfaction. This was personal for him in ways Minho could only partially understand. For 15 years, he'd served the Choi family with impeccable loyalty, his medical expertise saving lives and covering up deaths with equal efficiency. He'd earned his place through competence, not genetics. And then Derek had bonded with Ario. An Omega. A beautiful, sharp-minded Omega who'd somehow convinced the White Tiger that his opinions on strategy mattered. Who sat in meetings where beaters like Dr. Yun had to stand. Who had Derek's ear, his trust, his devotion. Things Dr. Yun had spent years cultivating and could never quite secure because he lacked the biological lottery of a bond mark. He was making Derek soft, Dr. Yun said, and the resentment bled through his carefully maintained professionalism. The great Biko, reduced to leaving meetings early for dinner at home. Turning down expansion opportunities because his Omega husband was concerned about increased risk. It was pathetic. It was disgusting, Minho agreed. He signaled for another round, and a silent server appeared with the bottle, poured, and vanished like smoke. Father built this empire on strength and fear. Derek inherited it and turned it into something almost legitimate, almost respectable, but he was still ruthless. Still brutal when he needed to be. Then he bonded with that Omega and suddenly everything became about building something for us, about keeping Ario safe. His voice dripped with contempt. He chose love over legacy. Over family. Over me. There it was, the core of Minho's rage. Not just ambition, but the wound of being overlooked. Their father had chosen Derek as heir despite Minho being older, more politically savvy, equally capable. The only difference was biology. Derek was alpha, dominant, and powerful. Minho was alpha too, but always second best, always in the shadow. And then Derek had compounded the insult by caring more about his Omega husband than about the empire, than about family, than about the brother who'd stood loyally at his side for years. We've already begun moving the pieces, Dr. Yun reported, shifting into business mode. I've diverted approximately 40 million won from the medical funds into accounts you control. Captain Jung is sympathetic to new leadership. His daughter was passed over for promotion because Derek thought her too aggressive. Captain Lee's loyalty can be bought. The port operations are already shifting toward your people. And the evidence? Untraceable. The toxin will never show up in standard testing. Even if someone ordered a specialized autopsy, which they won't, because I signed the death certificate, they'd need to know exactly what to look for. The T-service was disposed of. The surveillance footage from that night was corrupted during routine server maintenance. Dr. Yun allowed himself a thin smile. I've been preparing for this for months. Since Ario started asking questions about discrepancies in the medical budget. Minho's hand froze halfway to his glass. He knew. He suspected. Nothing concrete, but he was investigating. Another few weeks and he might have uncovered the Omega trafficking operation. Dr. Yun's voice hardened. So you see, his elimination served multiple purposes. We silenced the threat, removed Derek's stabilizing influence, and set the stage for transition. Efficient. I prefer thorough. They drank again, the scotch going down easier now. The private room felt less like a confession and more like a war room. Outside, Seoul continued its neon-lit chaos, unaware that the underworld's power structure was shifting beneath its feet. The best part, Dr. Yun said, a rare note of satisfaction entering his clinical voice, is that Derek is so broken he'd probably welcome death. The bond will kill him slowly anyway. Broken mate bonds are excruciating for alphas. His body is already deteriorating. Another few weeks and he'll be a shell. Putting him out of his misery will almost be a kindness. Minho laughed, a sound like breaking glass. My brother, the legendary White Tiger, reduced to a grief-stricken widower too destroyed to even fight back. There's poetry in it. There's justice in it, Dr. Yun corrected. The natural order restored. Alphas lead. Betas serve with competence. Omegas stay where they belong, decorative, functional, but never influential. They raised their glasses one final time. To the future, Minho declared. To the death of weakness, Dr. Yun added. The crystal rang like a funeral bell as they toasted over the grave of the empire they were stealing and the man they believed was already dying. Neither noticed the small recording device hidden in the decorative light fixture above their booth, one of 12 surveillance points Ario had personally installed 3 months ago when his investigation into Dr. Yun had first led him to Club Eclipse. The dead, it seemed, still had excellent timing. Day 11 after the funeral, Derek Choi walked into his office and found a ghost. Not literally, though at this point, he wouldn't have been surprised. The sleepless nights and the Bond Mark's phantom burning had blurred the line between reality and grief-induced hallucination. But this was tangible. Physical. Impossible. On his desk, placed with deliberate precision in the exact center of the polished mahogany surface, sat Ario's silver wolf pendant. Derek stopped breathing. The pendant was custom-made, a gift Derek had commissioned for their 3rd bonding anniversary. Sterling silver shaped into a running wolf, Korean characters engraved on the back, half of my soul. Ario had worn it every single day for 2 years, tucked beneath his shirts, resting against his heart. Derek had last seen it around his husband's neck at the funeral, carefully placed before they'd closed the casket. It should be buried 6 feet under marble and earth. Beside the pendant lay a single white camellia, fresh and perfect, its petals still dewy as if it had been cut minutes ago. Derek's Bond mark suddenly flared warm, not the phantom pain he'd been enduring, but genuine heat, the sensation of a living connection pulsing with life. His knees buckled. He caught himself against the desk, one hand pressed to his neck where the mark burned like a brand, the other reaching for the pendant with trembling fingers. The moment he touched the silver, a sound escaped him, something between a sob and a growl. The metal was still warm. Still carrying a scent that made his inner wolf howl with recognition and impossible hope. Ario. Jihoon. Derek's voice cracked like a whip. His beta assistant appeared in the doorway within seconds, tablet in hand, expression professionally concerned. Who entered my office? No one, sir. You were the first person through that door since the cleaning crew left at 6 a.m. Check the security footage. Now. Jihoon's fingers flew across the tablet, pulling up the surveillance feeds. Derek watched over his shoulder as they scrubbed through 8 hours of footage. The office door never opened. The windows, 60 stories up, remained sealed. The camera showed an empty desk at 6:47 a.m. At 2:13 p.m., Derek walked in and the pendant was simply there, as if it had materialized from nothing. There's no explanation, sir. The footage is continuous, no gaps, no edits. Nothing. Jihoon's scent carried confusion and a hint of fear. Should I call security? No. Derek's voice had gone cold, calculated. The grief that had been suffocating him for 11 days was crystallizing into something sharper, more dangerous. Leave me. Jihoon fled. Derek stood alone in his office, the pendant clutched in his fist, staring at the white camellia. His mind, the same strategic instrument that had built an empire, was finally, blessedly, working again. Not drowning in emotion, but analyzing. Computing possibilities. Scenario 1, he was losing his mind, and this was an elaborate hallucination. Scenario 2, someone was playing a cruel game, using his dead husband's belongings to torture him. Scenario 3, Ario was alive. His Bond mark burned warmer, as if confirming the impossible. Derek returned to his penthouse as sunset bled across Seoul's skyline. The pendant hung around his neck now, tucked beneath his shirt where it rested against his heart, right where it belonged. He moved through the apartment like a man in a trance, pouring whiskey he wouldn't drink, standing at windows he didn't see through. His private computer chimed. The sound was innocuous, just a notification ping. But Derek's predator instincts, dormant for 11 days, suddenly roared to life. He crossed to his desk where his personal laptop sat, a machine he used for nothing syndicate-related, a device whose access codes only 2 people in the world knew. The screen showed a login attempt in progress. Username, Ario Choi_live. Derek's heart stopped. His hands shook as he grabbed the laptop, watching the cursor move across the screen with deliberate purpose. Not a hack. Hacks were violent, brute force. This was surgical, almost playful. Like someone who already had the passwords was choosing to announce their presence rather than slip in unnoticed. A file began downloading automatically. Audio format. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Derek hit play. Minho's voice, smooth and satisfied, the Omega was making Derek soft. Distracted. He spent more time worrying about his pretty husband than running the empire our father built. Dr. Yun, clinical and cold, the toxin is untraceable. They'll rule it natural causes. Derek will grieve, spiral, make mistakes. We'll have full control within 40 days. The conversation continued, a blueprint of betrayal laid out in excruciating detail. The poisoning. The embezzlement. The planned coup. The final accident they had scheduled for Derek himself. Every word was a knife between his ribs, but Derek's hands had stopped shaking. His breathing had steadied. The chaos of grief was burning away, replaced by something arctic and absolute. Rage. Not the hot, impulsive fury of a wounded alpha. The cold, patient wrath of a predator who just identified his prey. The best part? Derek's so broken, he'd probably welcome death. The bond will kill him slowly anyway. The recording ended. Derek sat in the darkness of his penthouse, the pendant warm against his chest, the bond mark burning with impossible life, and felt the monster inside him wake up. The version of himself he'd tried to soften for Ario, the brutality he'd attempted to temper with love, it was back, and it was hungry. He pulled out his phone, not the syndicate phone with dozens of contacts, but the old burner he kept in his office safe. There was only one number programmed into it. He hadn't called it in 3 years, not since the last time he'd needed someone disappeared so thoroughly that even their memory became a ghost story. Derek typed a single word, hunt. The response came within seconds, target? Derek's fingers moved across the screen, wait for my signal. 2 targets. Clean capture. I want them alive. Understood, Biko. Derek set the phone down and picked up the pendant, holding it to the light. The Korean characters caught the city glow, half of my soul. If you're alive, he whispered to the Silver Wolf, his voice raw but steady, I will burn this city down to find you. If you're a ghost, I'll follow you into hell. His bond mark flared in response, warm and insistent and utterly real. Either way, they die. I promise you that. The pendant seemed to pulse in his palm, as if somewhere in Seoul, his Omega husband was holding his own bond mark and feeling the same impossible heat. The white tiger was done grieving. Now he was hunting. The text came at 3 a.m., just coordinates and a time, Seongsuian Mill. Dawn. Come alone. Derek stared at his phone in the darkness of his penthouse, his heart a war drum in his chest. The Seongsu Mill had been abandoned for 8 years, a rust-eaten corpse of Seoul's industrial past crumbling on the banks of the Han River. It was also where he'd first met Ario 6 years ago, a weapons deal gone wrong, bullets flying, and an Omega who'd appeared from nowhere with information that had saved Derek's life and earned him a permanent place at the White Tiger's side. If this was a trap, it was perfectly baited. If this was real, it was everything. Derek armed himself, Glock at his spine, knife at his ankle, the kind of preparation that was instinct after 20 years in the syndicate. But he went alone, against every tactical bone in his body, because the coordinates had been sent from Ario's phone and the bond mark on his neck was burning like a star. Dawn was breaking cold and gray when Derek arrived, the mill looming against the bruised sky like a monument to decay. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. Graffiti covered the walls in layers of color and profanity. The air smelled of river water and rust and something else, something that made Derek's alpha senses snap to attention. White camellias. Fresh ones, scattered across the concrete like a path leading into the mill's hollow heart. Derek followed them. Inside, the mill was a cathedral of shadows and steel bones. Old machinery hulked in the darkness, covered in rust and bird droppings. His footsteps echoed. His hand moved to his gun, but he didn't draw, not yet. Not when every instinct was screaming that this wasn't danger, this was destiny. Hello, Derek. The voice came from the shadows near what used to be the main furnace. Ario stepped into a shaft of dawn light filtering through the broken roof, and Derek's world tilted on its axis. He was alive. Thinner, the sharp lines of his face more pronounced, dark circles under his eyes like bruises. He wore all black, jeans, turtleneck, boots made for running. His hair was longer than Derek remembered, falling into his eyes. But he was alive, standing there with white camellias at his feet and fury radiating from every line of his body. Derek's careful control, the cold calculation he'd built over 11 days of grief and rage, shattered like glass. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, but Ario's hand came up, palm out, stopping him inches away. Don't. The single word was a knife. Derek froze, his alpha instincts howling to touch, to scent, to confirm what his eyes were telling him, but his broken heart couldn't quite believe. You've been so buried in guilt, Ario said, and his voice shook with righteous anger, that you didn't even feel our bond was intact? 11 days, Derek. 11 days I've been alive, and you convinced yourself I was dead. The bond mark, Derek's voice cracked. I felt phantom pain. I thought I was losing my mind. It's not phantom pain. Ario grabbed Derek's wrist and pressed his hand to his own neck, where the bond mark burned hot and alive beneath Derek's palm. The connection slammed into Derek like a physical blow, the mate bond, strained but unbroken, pulsing with Ario's fury and fear and desperate love. I'm right here. I've been right here. But you were so consumed by guilt and grief that you couldn't feel the difference between a broken bond and a traumatized one. Derek's knees wanted to buckle. His hand trembled against Ario's neck, feeling the pulse, the warmth, the impossible reality of living flesh. I thought I was going mad. I felt you everywhere, your scent in the penthouse, your presence in empty rooms. I convinced myself it was just grief playing tricks. It was me, Ario whispered, and now his anger was cracking, revealing the hurt underneath. Leaving signs. Trying to reach you. Watching you fall apart and not being able to just walk back into your life because they're still hunting me, Derek. They think I'm dead, and that's the only advantage we have. They? But Derek already knew. The recording. The poison. The calculated betrayal. Minho and Dr. Yun. Ario pulled away, wrapping his arms around himself like armor. They poisoned me with an omega-specific toxin designed to mimic heat death. Mrs. Kang, the coroner, she saved me. Recognized the assassination. I heard them planning your murder while I was lying in the morgue drawer. The words were matter-of-fact, but Derek could hear the trauma threaded through them. His Omega had died and been resurrected, had hidden in the shadows while his Alpha grieved, had been forced to watch from a distance as the Syndicate prepared to tear itself apart. I've been investigating, Ario continued, his voice strengthening. Dr. Yun's been running an Omega trafficking ring through the Syndicate's medical facilities. Selling suppressants on the black market, making vulnerable Omegas disappear into overseas clinics. I was close to exposing him. So they decided to kill 2 birds, silence me and weaken you. Derek's rage was a living thing now, coiled and ready to strike. I have resources. Enforcers. I'll have you on a plane to Singapore within an hour. Somewhere safe while I burn them down. No. Ario's eyes flashed. Absolutely not. Ario. Don't you dare. Ario stepped forward now, closing the distance Derek had been denied, getting into his alpha space with the kind of fearless challenge that had made Derek fall in love with him in the first place. I'm not your weakness, Derek. I'm your weapon. And I'm going to prove it. You almost died. I did die. Ario's voice echoed through the empty mill. I died, and I came back, and I spent 11 days gathering evidence while you fell apart. I have financial records. Surveillance footage. Witness testimony. I know their plans, their timetables, their weaknesses. His hands fisted in Derek's shirt. I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I'm standing beside you and watching them burn. Derek stared at his Omega, his mate, his mirror, his equal, and finally saw what he should have seen all along. Not someone to protect. Someone to fight alongside. Together, Derek said, his hands coming up to frame Ario's face, finally touching, finally scenting. The bond mark flared gold on both their necks as Derek buried his face in Ario's hair, breathing in the scent that was home and safety and fury combined. Never again. We do this together or not at all. Ario's arms wrapped around him, and for one stolen moment they just held each other. Two halves of a broken whole finally, desperately reconnecting. Then they pulled apart, and the softness hardened into strategy. They sat on the concrete floor surrounded by camellias and rust, and they planned war. Ario pulled out a tablet with encrypted files. Derek made calls on his burner phone. They shared information like puzzle pieces clicking into place, Ario's evidence of the trafficking ring, Derek's knowledge of syndicate operations, the perfect trap they would set together. The autumn harvest ceremony, Ario said. 40 days from my death. Every family will be there. Maximum visibility. You walk in alive, Derek continued, his mind already mapping the logistics. We expose them in front of everyone. No shadows, no quiet executions. Public judgment. Poetic. Necessary. Derek's hand found Ario's, their fingers interlacing. They used syndicate law against us. We'll use it to destroy them. As dawn broke fully over Seoul, the White Tiger and his resurrected mate sat in the ruins where they'd first found each other, and planned the resurrection of their empire. This time, built on partnership instead of protection. This time, invincible. Ario had always believed that ghosts were more terrifying than monsters. Monsters could be fought, killed, defeated. But ghosts? Ghosts slipped through locked doors and waited in shadows and reminded you that some sins could never be escaped. So he became one. Day 14 after his death, Minho opened his car, a custom Audi A8 kept in a private garage with biometric security, and found white camellias scattered across the driver's seat. Fresh ones. Still wet with dew. The garage footage showed nothing. The locks hadn't been breached. The flowers were simply there, like they'd materialized from the air itself. Minho told himself it was a prank. Bad taste, but explainable. Day 16, he arrived at his private gym at 5 a.m., a facility he owned outright where he trained alone to avoid showing weakness in front of other alphas. The camellias were arranged in a perfect circle around his weight bench. His personal trainer, the only other person with access, had been on vacation in Jeju for 3 days. Day 18, Minho's mistress, a beta actress he kept in a Gangnam apartment, called him screaming. Someone had filled her bedroom with funeral incense while she slept. The scent of sandalwood and ceremony hung thick enough to choke on. Security cameras caught nothing. The door had never opened. Minho stopped sleeping through the night. Dr. Yun's torment was more sophisticated, more personal. He woke one morning to find his offshore accounts, hidden under 3 layers of shell corporations and encrypted access codes, draining. Not dramatically. Just small amounts. 10,000 one here. 50,000 there. Amounts that whispered, I can reach you anywhere. He changed all his passwords. The money kept disappearing. Then came the gifts. A package delivered to Dr. Yun's office. A framed photo from Ario's funeral, the image showing the closed casket surrounded by white camellias. No return address. No note. Just the picture and the implication. Another package to Minho's penthouse, a traditional mourning portrait of Ario, the kind families kept on ancestral altars. It arrived with a stick of funeral incense, already lit, the smoke curling into the air like accusation. The syndicate began to whisper. Ario's ghost is angry. The Omega won't rest until justice is served. You can't kill a bonded mate and expect peace. The whispers were helped along by Derek's performance. He played the grieving alpha with devastating accuracy, showing up to meetings late and distracted, his suit rumpled, his scent sour with alcohol and despair. He let reports pile up. Made small mistakes in judgment. Deferred to Minho's helpful suggestions with the dead-eyed compliance of someone who'd stopped caring. At a captain's meeting, Derek actually dozed off mid-presentation. The room had gone silent with second-hand embarrassment. Minho had smoothly taken over, shooting meaningful looks at the other syndicate leaders. See? He's broken. We need a change. What they didn't see was Derek and Ario in the industrial safe house near Incheon, working through the night like the lethal partnership they'd always been. Jung is solid, Derek reported, marking names on a digital map of syndicate loyalty. I've known him since we were kids. He'll stand with us. Lee is bought, Ario countered, cross-referencing financial records. Dr. Yun transferred 200 million won to his accounts last month. He's compromised. They worked in tandem, Ario's investigation merging with Derek's insider knowledge, creating a complete picture of the conspiracy. Evidence was compiled. Loyalists were quietly secured. The trap was being set with surgical precision. But it was the stolen moments between the strategy sessions that Derek treasured most. 3 weeks after the reunion at the mill, Derek found Ario standing at the safe house window, staring at Seoul's lights with haunted eyes. The Omega hadn't been sleeping well, nightmares of the poisoning, of suffocation, of waking in the morgue drawer. His body was healing, but the trauma ran deeper. "Come here," Derek said softly. Ario turned, and for once, didn't argue. Didn't insist on strength or independence. Just walked into Derek's arms and let himself be held. Derek scented him properly for the first time in weeks, not the desperate confirmation of the mill, but the slow, thorough claiming of an alpha who'd almost lost his mate. He pressed his face to Ario's neck, breathing in the scent of white camellias and determination and survival. His hands traced the sharp edges of Ario's shoulder blades, the weight he'd lost during recovery. "I'm sorry," Derek whispered against Ario's skin. "For being distant. For not scenting you properly. For making you feel like you had to investigate alone. I'm sorry for not trusting you with the truth." Ario's hands fisted in Derek's shirt. "I thought I had to prove I was more than just your protected Omega. I thought if I brought you concrete evidence, you'd see me as an equal partner. I've always seen you that way." Derek pulled back just enough to meet Ario's eyes. "I just forgot to show it. Got caught up in building walls to keep you safe instead of standing beside you. Never again. Never again." They kissed then, not the desperate collision of the reunion, but something slower, deeper, a renewal of everything they'd almost lost. The bond marks on their necks flared gold, and for the first time since the poisoning, Ario felt completely safe. Later, as Ario mapped out the final phase of their psychological campaign, Derek watched him work with fierce pride. His Omega was brilliant, ruthless when needed, and absolutely terrifying when properly motivated. "One more message," Ario said, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Something personal for Dr. Yun." That night, Dr. Yun returned to his luxury apartment in Qingdam-dong to find his bedroom untouched, his security system active, his door still locked. He checked every room. Found nothing. Convinced himself the paranoia was getting to him. Then he pulled back his blankets. A note on his pillow, written in Ario's elegant handwriting, "I know what you did. And I'm coming." Dr. Yun's scream brought his security team running. They found him backing away from the bed, his beta pheromones reeking of pure, primal fear, the scent of prey who'd finally realized the predator had been inside the house all along. For the next 3 days, Dr. Yun jumped at shadows. Slept with lights on. His hands shook during meetings. The clinical precision he'd always projected crumbled into paranoid fragments. From a surveillance van parked 2 blocks away, Derek and Ario watched the security feed of Dr. Yun's apartment, monitoring his descent into terror. "Think he's scared enough?" Derek asked. Ario's smile was absolutely merciless. "Almost. 23 more days until the ceremony. By then, he'll be begging for death." "Good." Derek kissed his Omega's temple. "Let them suffer like we did." "No," Ario corrected, his voice soft and deadly. "Worse." The autumn harvest ceremony was held at the Myeongseong estate, a traditional compound in the hills north of Seoul where the old families gathered once a year to honor their ancestors and reaffirm syndicate bonds. The estate was 300 years old, all curved rooflines and paper screens, surrounded by gardens that blazed with fall colors. Tonight, it looked like something from a historical drama, lanterns glowing warm against the darkness, security disguised as servants, and every major criminal family in Korea dressed in formal hanbok. It was beautiful. Traditional. The perfect stage for a resurrection. Minho had orchestrated everything. 40 days of mourning had passed, the traditional period for grieving a spouse. The timing was culturally appropriate, politically strategic. He'd spent weeks laying groundwork with the other families, subtle suggestions that Derek was too compromised to lead, that temporary support might be necessary. Tonight, he would make his move with the blessing of tradition and the appearance of compassion. Derek arrived exactly on time, and the whispers started immediately. He looked devastated. His hanbok was black silk, morning colors, perfectly tailored but somehow hanging wrong on his frame as if he'd lost weight. His face was gaunt, shadows under his eyes. His alpha pheromones were muted, dull, nothing like the overwhelming dominance everyone associated with Biko. He moved through the receiving line like a ghost, accepting condolences with hollow nods, barely present. The other families exchanged knowing looks. The white tiger is broken. The ceremony began with ancestral rites in the main hall, incense burning, formal bows, prayers spoken in classical Korean. Derek participated mechanically, his eyes distant. When it was time to honor his own recent dead, he stood before the altar where a memorial photo of Ario had been placed among the chrysanthemums, and the entire hall watched him break. His hands shook as he lit the incense. His breath hitched audibly. Minho stood nearby, appropriately solemn, playing the supportive brother with Academy Award precision. The formal dinner followed in the grand hall, a massive space with high ceilings, traditional ondol heating beneath polished floors, and screens painted with landscapes and phoenixes. 60 members of the syndicate's core families sat at low tables arranged in careful hierarchy. The Choi family table was at the center, elevated, where Derek sat with Minho, Dr. Yun, and the senior captains. Derek barely touched his food. Drank steadily from a bottle of soju that Minho kept refilling with fraternal concern. After the main course, Minho stood. The hall fell silent. Honored families, he began, his voice carrying that perfect balance of strength and humility. We gather tonight not just to celebrate the harvest, but to address a concern that weighs on all our hearts. His eyes swept the room. My brother, Derek, has carried an impossible burden these past 40 days. He lost his bonded mate, a tragedy no alpha should endure. He has mourned with dignity, but... Minho paused, letting the word hang heavy. We all see how he suffers. The syndicate requires leadership that is clear-headed, decisive. I propose, with the deepest respect and love for my brother, that Derek take a temporary leave. Allow himself time to heal properly. Allow the family to support him by shouldering responsibilities until he is ready to return. The room erupted in murmurs. Some heads nodded sympathetically. Others looked uncomfortable but couldn't argue with the logic. Derek sat motionless, staring at his plate like he hadn't heard a word. I call for a formal vote, Minho continued. All those in favor. The doors to the grand hall opened. Not the small side entrance for servants, but the massive ceremonial doors that only opened for the most important arrivals. They swung wide with a sound like thunder, and the cold autumn air rushed in, carrying the scent of white camellias. Every head turned. Ario stood in the doorway. He wore a hanbok of black silk with gold embroidery, phoenixes rising from flames, stitched in thread that caught the lantern light and seemed to burn. His hair was styled traditionally, pulled up and secured with a silver pin. His face was pale but composed, beautiful and terrible as a blade. He carried himself like royalty walking into their own throne room, and the bond mark on his neck was visible, gleaming gold against his skin. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of ceremony, but the absolute void of shock. Omegas gasped, hands flying to mouths. Alphas went still with the instinctive freeze of predators confronted with something that shouldn't exist. Several people stood, chairs scraping. Someone dropped a cup, the crash absurdly loud. Ario walked forward, his steps measured, deliberate. White camellias appeared in his wake, scattered by unseen hands from the shadows. The screens around the hall, installed for ceremonial presentations, flickered to life. Surveillance footage. Crystal clear. Time-stamped. Minho's voice, the Omega was making Derek soft. Distracted. Dr. Yun, the toxin is untraceable. They'll rule it natural causes. The conspiracy laid bare for 60 witnesses to see. Ario reached the center of the hall, standing in the space between the family tables and the Choi platform. He looked up at Minho and Dr. Yun, who'd gone white as corpses. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Deadly. absolutely in control. I believe you gentlemen have something that belongs to me. His smile was a knife wrapped in silk. My life. Chaos erupted, shouting, questions, accusations. But it all fell silent when Derek stood. The transformation was instant and complete. The broken, grieving alpha vanished like smoke. What rose from that chair was Biko, the white tiger at full, terrifying power. His pheromones exploded through the hall like a shockwave, so dominant that half the alphas present physically flinched. His eyes, dead and distant moments ago, now burned with arctic fury. He stepped down from the platform to stand beside Ario, and the message was unmistakable: we are united. We are dangerous. We are done playing. Explain yourselves, Derek said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. Or die where you stand. Minho tried to run. Dr. Yun tried to speak. But Derek's enforcers, loyal men who'd been waiting for this signal, moved like shadows. Every exit was blocked. Every escape cut off. The trap had closed. You attempted to murder my bonded mate, Derek continued, his voice dropping to something below a growl, something primordial that made even the senior families lean back. You conspired to steal my family's legacy. You broke every law that holds this syndicate together. Ario's hand found Derek's, their fingers interlacing. The evidence is comprehensive, Ario added, his voice carrying across the silent hall. Financial records. Witness testimony. The toxin analysis. And everyone here just watched the confession. On the screens, the footage continued to play, every damning word, every calculated betrayal. Syndicate law is clear, Derek said, and now he was speaking to the room, to the families who would bear witness and carry this story forward. Attempted murder of the head family's bonded mate. Conspiracy to commit coup. Embezzlement. Trafficking. His eyes locked on Minho. The penalty is death. We're blood. Minho screamed, his alpha composure finally shattering. You can't. You killed my blood. Derek's voice was flat, final. You tried to kill my mate. You don't get to hide behind family now. Dr. Yun made a break for it, desperate, panicked. He didn't make it 3 steps before enforcers had him on the ground, his beta scent rank with terror. Ario turned to address the hall, and when he spoke, every Omega present leaned forward, hungry for his words. I am not weak because I'm Omega, he said, projecting strength that made several alphas shift uncomfortably. I am dangerous because you thought I was. Because you saw my designation and assumed fragility. Assumed I could be eliminated. His smile was absolutely merciless. I am standing here, resurrected from your murder attempt, and I promise you this. Never again will Omegas in this syndicate be treated as disposable. The Omegas in the room, mates, family members, a few syndicate members themselves, straightened. Something had shifted. Power redistributed. Derek raised his hand, and the enforcers dragged Minho and Dr. Yun forward, forcing them to their knees before the assembled families. You will witness justice, Derek announced. And you will remember. The White Tiger and his Phoenix stood together, and Soul's underworld learned a new truth: some bonds couldn't be broken. Some ghosts came back. And some resurrections were really revolutions. The Grand Hall of Myeongseong Estate had witnessed 3 centuries of syndicate history, treaties signed, alliances forged, power transferred through careful negotiation and blood when necessary. But it had never seen anything like this. Minho was dragged back to the center, fighting like a cornered animal, his alpha pride shattered into desperate survival instinct. Dr. Yun had gone silent, his beta pragmatism calculating odds that kept coming up zero. Derek's enforcers, led by Jin, the man Derek had texted that single word hunt 2 weeks ago, formed an impenetrable perimeter. Every exit was blocked. Every window watched. This wasn't spontaneous justice. This was an execution chamber dressed as ceremony. This is insane. Minho screamed, appealing to the assembled families. He's been manipulated by that Omega. Can't you see? Derek's not thinking clearly. I've never been more clear. Derek's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. He remained standing beside Ario, his hands still interlaced with his mates, presenting a united front that was more powerful than any throne. Present the evidence. Ario stepped forward, and the hall fell silent again. He moved with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. A tablet materialized in his hands, one of Derek's enforcers passing it to him smoothly. The screens around the hall switched from the surveillance footage to display financial documents. Dr. Yun, Ario began, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a prosecutor, has embezzled approximately 400 million won from syndicate medical funds over the past 18 months. The screens showed account numbers, transaction records, shell corporations. These funds were used to establish an Omega trafficking operation disguised as overseas medical clinics. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Omega families looked horrified. Even some of the alphas shifted uncomfortably. Trafficking violated several syndicate codes. I have testimony from 12 Omegas who were told they were receiving legitimate medical care, only to be sold into bonded servitude. Ario's voice hardened. 3 of them died in transit. Their families were told it was medical complications. The screens showed photos, young faces, desperate eyes, official death certificates signed by Dr. Yun himself. This is fabricated. Dr. Yun shouted, but his scent betrayed him. Fear and guilt mixed into something nauseating. I served this family for 15 years. You served yourself. Ario didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The evidence spoke. And when I discovered your operation, when I started asking questions about discrepancies in the medical budget, you decided to eliminate the threat. He gestured, and Mrs. Kang stepped from the shadows, the elderly Omega coroner who'd saved his life. She bowed respectfully to the assembled families before speaking. I analyzed the toxin used on Ario Choi Sai, she testified, her voice steady despite the weight of 60 powerful criminals watching. It was a modified compound derived from Aconitum corianum, Korean monkshood. Specifically designed to mimic acute heat shock syndrome in Omegas. The preparation requires advanced pharmaceutical knowledge and access to restricted compounds. She looked directly at Dr. Yun. Knowledge and access that only a syndicate physician would have. The screens displayed the toxicology report, the chemical analysis, the paper trail of pharmaceutical purchases made through Dr. Yun's medical license. Minho Choi, Ario continued, turning to Derek's half-brother, conspired with Dr. Yun to murder me and subsequently overthrow Derek. Financial records show 200 million won transferred to Captain Lee's accounts to secure his loyalty. Communications show coordination with 4 other mid-level captains to stage a coup following Derek's planned accident. More evidence flooded the screens, bank transfers, encrypted messages, decrypted, meeting records from Club Eclipse where the conspiracy had been hatched. We have audio recordings of you discussing my murder. Ario's voice dropped, personal now. Of you laughing about how the love-drunk fool would be easy to eliminate once his Omega weakness was removed. The recording played again, Minho's voice, clear and damning, the Omega was making Derek soft. The families were convinced. Ario could see it in their faces, the calculation, the self-preservation. Derek had presented an airtight case. To stand with the traitors now would be to admit complicity. Syndicate law is clear, Derek said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of Choi leadership. Article 7. Betrayal of the head family through conspiracy or violence is punishable by death. Article 12. Attempted murder of a bonded mate carries automatic execution. He paused, letting the law settle. Both charges have been proven before witnesses. Does anyone dispute the evidence? Silence. Even the families who'd been sympathetic to Minho's concerned brother act had nothing to say. The evidence was overwhelming. The law was unambiguous. Please, Minho's voice cracked, all his alpha arrogance stripped away to reveal the desperate man underneath. Derek, we're blood. We grew up together. Father would have killed you himself. Derek's voice was ice. And you're wrong. We're not blood anymore. You killed my blood. You tried to kill my mate. You poisoned the one person in this world who made me something more than a monster. I was trying to make you strong again. I am strong. Derek stepped closer to where Minho knelt, forced down by enforcers. I'm stronger now than I ever was. Because I finally understand that real power isn't isolation. It's not building walls or eliminating weaknesses. It's standing beside someone who makes you better and destroying anyone who threatens that. He looked at the assembled families. Take them outside. The traditional method. Away from the ceremonial space. Quick and final. Minho and Dr. Yun were dragged toward the side entrance, both screaming now, Minho's alpha rage, Dr. Yun's beta panic. The heavy doors closed behind them. The hall waited in suffocating silence. 3 minutes later, Jin returned alone. He bowed to Derek. It's done, Biko. The title echoed through the hall, not broken Derek, not grieving husband, but Biko. The White Tiger. Fully restored and more dangerous than ever. Derek took Ario's hand and faced the syndicate together. Things are changing, Derek announced. Starting tonight. Article 43 is repealed. Omegas are no longer barred from voting in family councils. Any family caught in trafficking, exploitation, or forced bonding of Omegas will be immediately expelled from the syndicate and their assets seized. Shock rippled through the old guard. This was revolutionary. Omegas had never had formal power in syndicate structure. Furthermore, Ario added, his voice ringing with authority earned through resurrection, an Omega Protection Committee will be established. Any Omega who feels unsafe or exploited can seek sanctuary and justice through syndicate channels. We will no longer be treated as commodities or collateral damage. An elderly alpha from the Song family stood, one of the traditionalists who'd been skeptical of Ario from the beginning. This is unprecedented. You're disrupting centuries of structure. I disrupted a murder plot and came back from the dead, Ario said smoothly. Precedent is overrated. A few nervous laughs. The tension cracked slightly. Does anyone wish to challenge this? Derek asked, his pheromones flooding the room with dominant alpha authority. Anyone who believes the old ways, the ways that allowed trafficking and assassination, are worth preserving. Silence. Heavy, complete, submission. Then it's decided. Derek's hand squeezed Ario's. The Choi family stands united. The syndicate adapts or becomes irrelevant. One by one, the families stood and bowed, acknowledging the new order, the resurrected Omega and his Alpha King. Some bowed with respect. Others with fear. But they all bowed. As the ceremony dissolved into tense conversations and political recalculations, Ario allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd been murdered for being an Omega. For being seen as Derek's weakness. Now he stood in a hall full of Korea's most dangerous criminals, and every single one of them understood, underestimating him had been their greatest mistake. And they would never make it again. 3 days after the autumn harvest ceremony became the bloodiest syndicate purge in a generation, Derek and Ario returned to the cemetery where it had all begun. Dawn was breaking cold and clear over Seoul, the autumn sky painted in shades of amber and rose. The private cemetery was empty except for them, the early morning mist clinging to the ground like ghosts reluctant to leave. Derek's security team waited at the gates, close enough for protection, far enough for privacy. Some things needed to be witnessed only by the two people who'd lived through them. They stood before Ario's grave. The marble headstone was exactly as Derek remembered, polished to mirror perfection, elaborately carved with traditional motifs, expensive enough to be obscene. Ario Choi, it read in elegant Hangul, followed by dates that marked a life cut short. Below that, an inscription Derek had chosen in the depths of grief, beloved husband, eternal light, forever mourned. I hated this thing, Derek said quietly, his hand finding Ario's. Every word was wrong. Forever mourned like I'd given up. Like you were really gone. It is beautiful, though, Ario admitted, studying the craftsmanship with the critical eye of someone looking at their own memorial. Expensive. Very you, excessive in grief like you're excessive in everything. Derek huffed a laugh, the sound rough but genuine. I was going to commission a mausoleum. Jin talked me out of it. Thank God for Jin. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sunrise paint the marble in shades of gold. This place had been the site of Derek's complete destruction, the lowest point of his life. He'd knelt here in the mud, convinced he'd lost everything that mattered. The memory was still raw, the suffocating grief, the phantom pain of a bond he'd believed was broken, the absolute certainty that his world had ended. But Ario had been watching from the shadows even then. Alive. Planning. Refusing to let their story end in tragedy. Ready? Derek asked. Ario nodded, and Derek retrieved the sledgehammer they'd brought, industrial, heavy, designed for demolition. He offered it to Ario first. Your turn. Ario took the hammer, testing its weight. For someone who'd been poisoned, died, and resurrected, he looked surprisingly steady. The past weeks had put muscle back on his frame, color back in his face. He was still thinner than before, still carried shadows in his eyes, but he was healing. They both were. Any particular technique? Ario asked, positioning himself before the headstone. Aim for the center. Put your whole body into it. And don't hold back. Derek stepped aside, giving him room. Pretend it's Dr. Yun's face. Ario's smile was sharp as broken glass. He hefted the sledgehammer, muscles coiling, and swung. The impact was deeply, viscerally satisfying. The marble cracked with a sound like breaking bones, a jagged line splitting the polished surface right through Ario's name. The headstone shuddered but held. Again, Derek encouraged. Ario swung again. And again. Each impact was catharsis made physical. Every fear, every moment of hiding, every second of watching Derek grieve while being unable to comfort him. The hammer became an instrument of liberation, and with each blow, the lie of his death fractured further. By the fifth swing, the headstone was no longer beautiful. It was ruins. Derek took the hammer next. His first swing obliterated what remained of the inscription, marble shards flying like shrapnel. His alpha strength, no longer leashed by grief, turned the elaborate memorial into rubble. He thought of every moment he'd wasted in guilt, every tear he'd shed while Ario suffered alone, every second he'd been too consumed by emotion to feel their bond still burning. The headstone fell. Chunks of marble crashed into the grass, some pieces as large as fists, others reduced to powder. The morning sun caught the fragments, making them glitter like snow. Where Ario's name had been carved in elegant permanence, there was now only destruction, beautiful in its own way, honest in its violence. They stood among the ruins, breathing hard, the sledgehammer abandoned in the grass. The grave itself remained untouched. There was no body to disturb, just empty earth that had held nothing but a lie. But the marker, the public declaration of death, was gone. Better, Ario said, his voice carrying satisfaction that bordered on feral. Much better. They buried the pieces, not all of them, but enough. A symbolic interment of the false death, of the version of events where Ario had died and Derek had broken and the traitors had won. The rest of the marble shards they left scattered, a monument to destruction rather than death. Then they planted white camellias. Not just one or two, but dozens, their roots bedded in rich soil where the headstone had stood. Ario's signature flower, transformed from funeral decoration to living memorial. These would grow, spread, bloom every spring, a reminder that some things refuse to stay buried. When the last camellia was planted, hands dirty with earth and effort, they turned to each other. The bond renewal wasn't planned. There was no ceremony, no witnesses, no formal words. But it happened anyway, as natural as breathing, as necessary as heartbeat. Derek pulled Ario close, scenting him thoroughly in the dawn light. Not the desperate confirmation of their reunion, not the tactical partnership of their revenge, but something deeper. A reclaiming of what they'd almost lost, a promise that they would never take this connection for granted again. Equal partners, Derek murmured against Ario's temple. In everything. No more protecting you from the world. No more hiding investigations from me. No more distance. Ario's hands fisted in Derek's coat. No more being too proud to ask for help. No more assumption that strength means solitude. They bit each other's bond marks, a searing, intimate renewal that made both of them gasp. The marks flared gold, brighter than they'd ever been, visible even in daylight. The bond snapped into place with renewed force, and for the first time since the poisoning, it felt complete. Healed. Stronger than before. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had fully risen over Seoul, burning away the mist. 6 months later. The syndicate under Derek and Ario's joint rule became something unprecedented in Korean underworld history. Not softer, but smarter. Not weaker, but more adaptable. The port operations expanded into legitimate shipping, money laundering evolved into strategic investment portfolios. The old families grumbled about the changes but couldn't argue with the profits. Derek's brutal efficiency combined with Ario's strategic intelligence created an empire that was both more profitable and more sustainable than anything the previous generation had built. The Omega Protection Committee, originally met with skepticism, became one of the syndicate's most valuable assets. Arios personally oversaw it, and within months, 12 Omegas had been extracted from dangerous situations, 3 trafficking rings had been dismantled, and the syndicate's reputation among Omega communities shifted from fear to grudging respect. Other families started implementing similar protections, not from altruism but from pragmatism. Omegas with agency and protection made better allies, better strategists, better long-term investments than Omegas kept as decorative prisoners. Derek and Ario worked from their penthouse most days. The space transformed from a grief-stained prison into a war room and sanctuary combined. They'd learned to balance intimacy with strategy, to separate partnership from business when needed and blur the lines when it served them. Some nights, Derek would find Ario standing at the windows, still processing trauma, still carrying scars. Those nights, he'd wrap himself around his Omega and just hold him, scenting away the nightmares, grounding him in the present. Other nights, Ario would catch Derek staring at the security footage again, not obsessively rewatching the past, but checking perimeters, confirming threats, the hypervigilance of someone who'd failed once and refused to fail again. Those nights, Ario would pull Derek away from the screens and remind him, "I'm here. I'm alive. We won." They were intimate again, not just physically, though they'd reconnected with an intensity that came from almost losing each other. But emotionally, strategically, in every way that mattered. They finished each other's sentences in meetings. Moved in sync during enforcement actions. Presented a united front so seamless that rivals stopped trying to find wedges between them. The underworld learned quickly. You couldn't manipulate Derek through his Omega, because Ario was just as dangerous. You couldn't underestimate Ario because of his designation, because he'd literally come back from death to destroy his enemies. And you definitely couldn't threaten one without the other becoming your nightmare. Present day. They stood on their penthouse balcony overlooking Seoul, 60 stories above the city they controlled. It was late evening, the sky purple with twilight, the city sprawling beneath them in a sea of lights that looked almost peaceful if you didn't know what happened in the shadows. Ario leaned against the railing, Derek's arms wrapped around him from behind, both of them watching their kingdom breathe. "Sometimes I think about that night," Ario said quietly. "The dinner. The tea. The moment I realized what was happening." His hand came up to cover Derek's, interlacing their fingers. "I was so angry, not just at them, but at us. At how we'd let distance grow. At how I'd kept secrets. At how you'd stopped really seeing me. I'm sorry." "Don't." Ario turned in Derek's arms, meeting his eyes. "I'm not telling you this for apologies. I'm telling you because they thought killing me would make you stronger. They thought removing the weakness would unleash the real white tiger." Derek's smile was sharp and satisfied. "They were idiots. They made us invincible," Ario corrected, rising on his toes to kiss his alpha, soft and certain and absolutely fearless. "We're stronger together than either of us could ever be alone. And now everyone knows it." The kiss deepened, and Seoul sparkled beneath them, unaware that 2 of its most dangerous residents were wrapped around each other 60 stories up, planning tomorrow's strategies and next year's expansions and a future that no one could take from them again. When they finally pulled apart, Derek kept Ario close, their foreheads pressed together, bond marks glowing faintly gold in the twilight. "Ready for the future?" Derek asked. "With you." Ario's smile was pure, fierce joy. "Always." They stood together on their balcony as night fell over Seoul, hands interlaced, facing forward, 2 survivors who'd become legends. The white tiger and his phoenix, resurrected and unbreakable. The city lights sparkled like stars, and somewhere in the shadows of Seoul's underworld, someone was probably plotting against them. Let them try. Derek and Ario had died once and come back stronger. What could possibly frighten them now?